Picture this: a thin strip of land, barely wide enough for a handful of men to stand shoulder to shoulder, flanked by steep cliffs on one side and the crashing waves of the Aegean on the other. This is Thermopylae, the place where 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas, faced down an invading force so vast it was said to blot out the sun. The story has been told and retold, immortalized in poems, paintings, and blockbuster films. But here's the question that lingers beneath the legend: how much of what we think we know about the 300 is actually true? The Battle of Thermopylae is one of those rare moments in history where myth and reality collide so dramatically that it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. We've all heard the stirring speeches, the tales of unmatched bravery, the image of a tiny band of warriors holding back an empire. But what if the real story, the one hidden beneath layers of exaggeration and Hollywood flair, is even more compelling? What if the truth reveals not just the heroism of the Spartans, but the cunning strategy, the political tensions, and the human stakes that made this battle a turning point in history? Today, we're peeling back those layers. We'll explore the real numbers behind the armies, the tactics that shaped the conflict, and the reasons why this clash between a handful of Greeks and the mighty Persian Empire still echoes through time. This isn't just about separating fact from fiction. It's about understanding why this moment captured the imagination of the ancient world and why it still resonates with us today. So join me as we step onto that narrow pass, not through the lens of myth, but through the eyes of history. The story of the 300 Spartans is about to get a lot more interesting. To truly grasp why the 300 Spartans became legendary, we need to step back into the heart of their world, Sparta itself. This wasn't just another Greek city-state. It was a society built on an almost obsessive focus on military excellence. From the moment a Spartan boy was born, his life was shaped by one purpose: to become an unbeatable soldier. Weakness wasn't tolerated, newborns were inspected, and those deemed unfit were left to perish. Those who survived were thrust into a brutal training system known as the Agoge, where boys as young as 7 were taken from their families and molded into warriors through hardship, discipline, and relentless competition. But Sparta's military culture went far beyond training. Every aspect of life was designed to strip away comfort and foster toughness. Spartans ate simple, meager meals, slept on rough reed beds, and wore plain clothing. Luxury was seen as a weakness. Even their speech was sharp and direct, giving us the word laconic from Laconia, the region they ruled. This wasn't just about creating strong soldiers. It was about forging an entire society that valued collective strength over individual fame. Unlike Athens, where art, philosophy, and democracy flourished, Sparta's identity was built on unity, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will. So when King Leonidas marched his 300 to Thermopylae, they weren't just warriors. They were the product of a system that had spent generations perfecting the art of war. Their legendary stand wasn't a spontaneous act of heroism. It was the culmination of a way of life. But here's where myth starts to blur reality. Popular retellings often paint the Spartans as lone heroes, standing against impossible odds. The truth is, they weren't alone. Alongside them fought several thousand other Greeks: Thespians, Thebans, and others who have been overshadowed by the Spartan legend. Yet it's the Spartans we remember, not just because of their skill, but because their entire society was a story waiting to be told. A story of discipline, defiance, and a code that prized honor above survival. That's how a military culture turned 300 men into immortal symbols of resistance. King Leonidas stands at the center of the Thermopylae legend. his name synonymous with unshakable courage. But the man behind the myth was far more complex than the larger-than-life figure we see in films. Historical accounts paint him not as an infallible warrior god, but as a shrewd leader navigating the brutal realities of Spartan politics and war. By the time he marched to Thermopylae, Leonidas was no young hero. He was in his 60s, a seasoned ruler who'd spent decades immersed in Sparta's cutthroat power structures. His decision to confront the Persians wasn't just about bravery. It was a calculated move shaped by prophecy, tradition, and the precarious balance of Greek alliances. Unlike the lone wolf commander of popular imagination, Leonidas didn't act alone. Spartan kings always ruled in pairs, a system designed to prevent tyranny, and major military decisions required approval from the Council of Elders. Even his famous last stand wasn't a spontaneous act of defiance. Ancient sources suggest the Spartans knew from the start their mission was likely suicidal, a delaying tactic to buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare its defenses. What made Leonidas remarkable wasn't superhuman strength, but his ability to inspire absolute loyalty in his men. When the Persian envoy demanded their weapons, his legendary reply, "Come and take them," wasn't just defiance. It was psychological warfare, crafted to demoralize an enemy that outnumbered them 1,000 to 1. The transformation of Leonidas into an invincible icon began long after his death. Later Greek writers, especially the Athenians, exaggerated his story to symbolize resistance against foreign oppression. By the Roman era, his legend had grown to mythic proportions, while the contributions of other Greek fighters faded into the background. Even the famous 300 number ignores the 7,000 other Greeks who fought alongside them in the pass's early days. Yet there's truth buried in the legend. Leonidas did make the ultimate choice to stay when retreat was possible, knowing it would cost his life. That blend of strategy, sacrifice, and sheer force of will is what makes the real man far more fascinating than the flawless hero of Hollywood tales. His legacy endures not because he was perfect, but because he was human, a leader who faced impossible odds and chose to meet them head-on. When we picture the Persian army at Thermopylae, it's easy to fall into the trap of imagining a mindless swarm, faceless soldiers clambering over one another in chaotic waves. But that image does a disservice to one of the most sophisticated military machines of the ancient world. Xerxes' forces weren't just a horde, they were a meticulously organized coalition drawn from the farthest corners of an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. The Persians didn't rely on sheer numbers alone. They brought specialized units, each with their own tactics and traditions, united under a single command structure that could move vast armies with surprising efficiency. Take the Immortals, for example, an elite corps of 10,000 soldiers whose name came from the eerie illusion that their ranks never dwindled. Whenever one fell in battle, another immediately took his place, maintaining an unbroken front. Then there were the cavalry from Central Asia, swift and deadly on horseback, and the armored spearmen from the heart of Persia, trained to fight in tight formations. Even the navy played a crucial role, with skilled Phoenician sailors maneuvering warships along the coast. This wasn't just an army. It was a living map of the empire's diversity, a force engineered to adapt to any battlefield. So how many actually faced the Greeks at Thermopylae? Ancient sources like Herodotus claim numbers so vast they border on fantasy, millions of troops, a figure modern historians dismiss as exaggeration. More plausible estimates suggest Xerxes marched with around 200,000 soldiers, though only a fraction could engage at once in the narrow pass. Even at the lower end, the odds were staggering. Against them stood a few thousand Greeks with the 300 Spartans at the core. The imbalance wasn't just in numbers, it was in resources, supply lines, and the sheer scale of Persian logistics. Keeping such an army fed and moving required planning that would impress modern generals. That's what makes the Spartans stand so extraordinary. They weren't just defying an overwhelming force, they were up against a system designed to crush resistance. Every advantage Persia had: numbers, versatility. Imperial reach was neutralized by the geography of Thermopylae and the discipline of the defenders. The past turned the empire's greatest strength into a weakness, funneling that vast army into a space where courage and skill could outweigh sheer quantity. The legend simplifies this into a story of bravery against mindless hordes, but the truth is far more compelling: a calculated defiance of an empire at the height of its power. Thermopylae wasn't chosen by accident, it was a geographical bottleneck that turned the laws of warfare upside down. Picture a natural corridor barely 50 feet wide in places, with towering cliffs pressing in on one side and the Malian Gulf's treacherous waters on the other. This wasn't just a defensive position, it was a tactical masterpiece, a place where the land itself became an ally to the outnumbered Greeks. For the Spartans, selecting this pass was like forcing a giant into a narrow alley where only one fist could swing at a time. The genius of Thermopylae lay in how it nullified every advantage Persia's army possessed. Cavalry, the pride of Persian forces, was useless in such confined space. Archers who could rain arrows by the thousands in open terrain found their volleys limited by the high walls of the pass. Even the sheer size of Xerxes' force became a liability. Only so many soldiers could engage at once, turning what should have been an overwhelming tide into a series of cramped, brutal skirmishes where discipline mattered more than numbers. The Greeks, fighting in tight phalanx formations with overlapping shields, turned the narrow ground into a killing zone. Every Persian charge broke against a wall of bronze and iron, with Spartans rotating fresh warriors to the front to maintain relentless pressure. But the pass had another secret weapon: the Hot Gates. Named for the nearby sulfur springs, this section of Thermopylae forced attackers into an even tighter space, where the Greeks built a crumbling stone wall as a final choke point. Here, the Spartans could hold for days, inflicting disproportionate losses while the rest of Greece mobilized. The terrain didn't just favor the defenders, it reshaped the entire psychology of the battle. Persian soldiers, used to sweeping victories in open battles, found themselves struggling in a nightmare of confined combat where their individual courage meant little against the Greeks' unbreakable cohesion. Yet Thermopylae's greatest strength also hid its fatal flaw. While the pass was nearly impregnable from the front, a little-known mountain trail, the Unmask path, offered a way around the Greek position. This was no wide road, but a narrow, treacherous track that local shepherds used. The Persians, guided by a traitorous Greek named Ephialtes, exploited this weakness, flanking Leonidas' forces and forcing the desperate last stand we remember today. The lesson was clear: even the best defensive position is only as strong as its most vulnerable point. Thermopylae's geography gave the Greeks days of glory, but it also underscored the relentless ingenuity of war, where every advantage can be undone by a single overlooked detail. The legend of the 300 Spartans has eclipsed the full story of Thermopylae, but the truth reveals a far more intricate tapestry of allied forces standing shoulder to shoulder against Persia. While Spartan warriors formed the spearhead of the Greek defense, they were bolstered by nearly 7,000 other soldiers from across the Greek world: Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, and warriors from smaller city-states, each bringing their own skills and motivations to the pass. The Thespians alone contributed 700 hoplites, matching Sparta's initial contingent in numbers if not in fame. These weren't mere background players, they fought with equal ferocity, yet history has largely erased their names from popular memory. So why did the Spartans dominate the narrative? Part of it lies in Sparta's carefully cultivated mystique. Even in antiquity, their society fascinated outsiders. A militarized culture where boys were raised in barracks, where weakness was weeded out ruthlessly, and where the concept of surrender didn't exist. Writers like Herodotus, crafting the story for Athenian audiences, amplified Spartan exceptionalism because it made for a compelling underdog tale. The image of a handful of flawless warriors standing against an empire played to Greek ideals of heroic resistance. But there's another, more practical reason. The Spartans weren't just warriors, they were symbols. Their presence at Thermopylae signaled the seriousness of the Greek resistance. Other city-states might waver, but Sparta's participation was a psychological rallying point, a guarantee that this wasn't just another skirmish, it was a fight for survival. The composition of the Spartan force itself tells a revealing story. These weren't raw recruits or conscripts. They were the king's personal retinue, handpicked from the elite homoioi, the equals who formed Sparta's warrior aristocracy. Each had spent decades training for this moment, their entire lives a preparation for war. Unlike other Greek soldiers who returned to farms or trades between conflicts, the Spartans were full-time fighters, their reputation built on a century of battlefield dominance. When they marched to Thermopylae, they carried not just weapons but the weight of expectation, an entire civilization's belief in their invincibility. Yet the Allied forces played roles just as crucial. The Thespians, often overlooked, made the extraordinary decision to stay with the Spartans in the final stand, knowing it meant certain death. The Phocians guarded the treacherous mountain path until overwhelmed. Even the much-maligned Thebans, later accused of Medism collaborating with Persia, fought fiercely before their controversial surrender. The imbalance in historical memory says less about their contributions and more about storytelling itself. Myths crave singular heroes, not complex coalitions. But the real Thermopylae was a collaboration, a moment when rival Greek city-states set aside differences to face a common threat. The 300 may have become legend, but they stood tallest because others lifted them up. The first clash at Thermopylae wasn't the bloodbath we often imagine. It began with a tense waiting game. For 3 days, the Greeks watched as the Persian army massed at the mouth of the pass, their numbers swelling like a storm gathering on the horizon. Xerxes, confident his mere presence would intimidate the defenders into retreat, sent envoys with offers of surrender and rewards. But Leonidas, steeped in Spartan defiance, met these overtures with the kind of laconic wit that would become legendary. When told to lay down his weapons, his reply, "Come and take them," wasn't just bravado. It was a psychological gambit, signaling to both his men and the enemy that there would be no negotiation, no compromise. This wasn't just a battle of spears, it was a battle of wills. The Greeks didn't waste those early days. While the Persians struggled to maneuver their vast forces into position, Leonidas' troops fortified the narrowest point of the pass, repairing an ancient wall built by the Phocians generations earlier. This crumbling barrier became their lifeline, a place where they could funnel the Persian advance into killing zones no wider than a city street. Every hour spent strengthening their position was an hour stolen from the invaders, a delay that bought precious time for the rest of Greece to prepare. The Spartans, masters of disciplined warfare, rotated their front lines seamlessly, keeping fresh fighters at the forefront while others rested just steps away. This wasn't just holding ground, it was a masterclass in controlled, calculated resistance. When the fighting finally began, the Persians learned a brutal lesson about Greek tactics. Their initial waves, light infantry from subject nations, charged into a wall of bronze shields and razor-sharp spears. The Phalanx formation, with its overlapping shields and coordinated thrusts, turned the narrow pass into a meat grinder. Persian soldiers, used to open battles where mobility mattered, found themselves crushed against their own comrades, unable to swing their weapons or retreat. The Greeks didn't just defend, they counterattacked with feigned retreats, luring overconfident units deeper into the pass before wheeling around to annihilate them. These weren't random skirmishes, they were carefully orchestrated maneuvers designed to maximize Persian casualties while minimizing Greek losses. Yet the most fascinating drama unfolded off the battlefield. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne atop a nearby hill, grew increasingly frustrated. He'd expected a swift victory, not a grinding stalemate. On the second day, he committed his elite immortals, believing their reputation would break Greek morale. Instead, they met the same fate as the others, their numbers useless in the confined space. Meanwhile, Greek spies and deserters fed Leonidas intelligence about Persian movements, while local shepherds revealed the existence of the hidden mountain path. The battle wasn't just a test of strength, it was a high-stakes game of information and deception, where every scrap of knowledge could tip the scales. By the third day, the Greeks had inflicted staggering losses, but the trap was closing. When news arrived that the Persians had found the flanking route, Leonidas faced an impossible choice. He dismissed most of the allied forces, sparing them for the larger war to come. But the Spartans, bound by their laws never to retreat from battle, stayed alongside the Thespians, who refused to abandon them. This moment, often portrayed as pure heroism, was also a coldly strategic decision. Someone had to hold the pass long enough for the retreating Greeks to escape, and Leonidas knew his men were the only ones disciplined enough to buy that time. The last stand wasn't just an act of defiance, it was the final move in a carefully played game where sacrifice served a greater tactical purpose. The real tragedy of Thermopylae isn't that the Spartans died, it's that they understood exactly why their deaths mattered. Every legend needs its villain, and the story of Thermopylae found one in Ephialtes, the local shepherd who supposedly doomed the 300 Spartans by revealing a hidden mountain path to the Persians. But history is rarely that simple. The man branded as Greece's greatest traitor might have been more complicated than the monster we imagine. Ancient sources describe him as a Malian native, familiar with the rugged terrain around Thermopylae. When he approached Xerxes' camp with knowledge of the Unmask path, a narrow, treacherous trail that could outflank the Greek position, he wasn't acting out of cartoonish malice. He was likely motivated by something far more human: ambition, desperation, or perhaps even a personal grudge against Sparta's dominance in the region. The Unmask path wasn't some well-kept secret. Local shepherds and hunters had used it for generations, and Greek commanders knew of its existence. Leonidas had stationed 1,000 Phocian troops to guard it, but they were caught off guard when Persian forces appeared under cover of darkness. Ephialtes didn't just point the way, he guided them personally, navigating the steep, winding route with intimate knowledge of every rock and crevice. This wasn't just betrayal, it was tactical expertise turned against his own people. Yet the question lingers, why would a Greek willingly aid an invading empire? Some historians speculate he expected wealth or status in Persia's new order. Others suggest coercion, that Persian scouts captured him and forced his cooperation. The truth may lie somewhere in between. A reminder that war rarely offers clear heroes or villains, only choices made under pressure. The consequences of his actions were immediate and devastating. With a path secured, Xerxes sent his elite immortals under cover of night, surrounding the Greeks by dawn. Leonidas, realizing the trap had sprung, made his fateful decision to dismiss most of the allied forces while the Spartans and a few others stayed to cover their retreat. Ephialtes' betrayal didn't just end a battle, it reshaped the entire Greek strategy. Thermopylae could no longer be held, forcing the allies to fall back and regroup. But the ripple effects went further. In the aftermath, the Greeks placed a bounty on Ephialtes' head, branding him an eternal outcast. According to Herodotus, he fled north, only to be killed years later in an unrelated feud, a fittingly murky end for a man whose legacy was reduced to a single, infamous act. Yet it's worth asking whether Ephialtes alone should shoulder the blame. The Greek defense had a critical weakness. They'd underestimated the Persians' ability to adapt. Leonidas knew the Anapia path existed but assumed the Phocians could hold it indefinitely. When the flanking maneuver succeeded, it exposed a broader truth about warfare. No position is impregnable if the enemy finds its weak point. Ephialtes became the scapegoat, but the real lesson was about preparation, not treachery. Even the most heroic stands can crumble when a single oversight is exploited. His name became synonymous with betrayal, but in many ways he was just the instrument of a larger, inevitable truth. In war, geography favors those who understand it best. The story of Ephialtes forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty and survival. Was he a traitor, or simply a man navigating the brutal realities of conquest? The Greeks needed a villain to explain their loss, but history is full of such figures, ordinary people whose decisions, for better or worse, tilt the scales of great events. What makes Thermopylae's betrayal so haunting isn't just the act itself, but what it reveals about the fragility of even the most heroic defenses. The pass was a fortress until it wasn't. The 300 were invincible until they met their end, and Ephialtes, he was just a man until history turned him into something far darker. The final hours at Thermopylae were nothing like the slow-motion heroics of Hollywood. Ancient accounts paint a far messier, more desperate scene, one where exhaustion, dwindling weapons, and the crushing weight of numbers transformed the pass into a slaughterhouse. By the third day, the Spartans and their remaining allies knew death was inevitable. Their spears shattered from overuse, their swords blunted by relentless combat. When Persian forces finally encircled them from both ends of the pass, the Greeks didn't form a neat defensive circle. They fought in fractured pockets, backs against the cliffs, using rocks and broken weapons when their own failed. Herodotus describes Leonidas falling early in the chaos, his body becoming a rallying point as Spartans fought ferociously to protect their king's corpse, a detail often lost in modern retellings. The myth of a unified last stand overlooks the brutal reality of combat fatigue. After days of non-stop fighting, even the legendary Spartan discipline began to crack. Some accounts suggest small groups attempted breakout charges while others were pushed into the sea. The Thespians, often erased from the narrative, died just as bravely beside their Spartan allies. And what of the famous 300 number? It's likely symbolic, a rounded figure representing only the Spartiates, the full citizens, while omitting hundreds of helot attendants who fought and perished with them. This wasn't a clean, glorious sacrifice. It was a bloody, grinding end where every life exacted the highest possible price from the invaders. Popular culture loves the image of Spartans fighting to the last man, but sources hint at a more complicated finale. Diodorus Siculus claims 2 Spartans survived, one blinded in battle, another sent away as a messenger only to face disgrace at home for outliving their comrades. Even the fate of Leonidas' body carries contradictions. While most versions say it was decapitated and crucified by Xerxes, some Persian records suggest he received an honorable burial. These inconsistencies reveal how quickly myth overwrote history. Within decades, the battle was already being reframed as a parable of freedom versus tyranny, with inconvenient details smoothed away. The real Thermopylae wasn't a perfectly staged drama. It was a human event, raw and unscripted, where courage and chaos collided in equal measure. What makes the truth more compelling than the myth is its humanity. These weren't invincible super soldiers, they were exhausted men making impossible choices. When their weapons broke, they used teeth and fists. When their formation collapsed, they fought alone. That messy, unvarnished heroism, flawed, desperate, but unbroken, resonates far deeper than any polished legend. The Spartans didn't need Hollywood's embellishment. Their real story, in all its gritty desperation, was extraordinary enough. History remembers the Spartans, but the Thespians and Thebans who stood beside them at Thermopylae deserve their own chapter in this story. While Sparta's warriors became legend, these allies made choices just as consequential choices that reveal the complex web of loyalty, politics, and sacrifice woven into the battle. The Thespians, hailing from a small city-state in central Greece, had no obligation to stay when Leonidas ordered the retreat, yet all 700 of them chose to remain, knowing it meant near certain death. Their motivation wasn't just bravery, it was a calculated defiance. Unlike Sparta, Thespiae had no professional army. These were farmers, craftsmen, and fathers who understood the stakes. If Thermopylae fell, their homes would be next. Their decision to fight wasn't about glory, it was about buying time for their families to flee south. The Thebans present an even thornier puzzle. Ancient sources, particularly the Athenian-biased Herodotus, paint them as reluctant participants, even suggesting they surrendered to the Persians at the last moment. But newer archaeological evidence tells a different story. Theban soldiers left behind inscriptions and grave markers near Thermopylae, hinting at a fiercer resistance than previously acknowledged. Why the discrepancy? Politics. Thebes had a complicated relationship with Persia, sometimes seen as sympathetic to Persian overtures. After the war, rival Greek city-states had every reason to downplay Theban heroism. Yet contemporary accounts note Theban units fighting viciously in the final hours, their fate overshadowed by Sparta's myth-making machine. What united these groups was something deeper than tactics, a shared understanding of what Thermopylae represented. For the Thespians, it was protecting their way of life. For the Thebans, it may have been proving their loyalty to Greece despite their city's political ambiguities. And for both, it was about standing together in a moment that transcended local rivalries. The pass became a crucible where ordinary men became something greater, not because of Spartan discipline, but because they chose to rise when it mattered most. Their stories remind us that history isn't just written by the victors, it's often edited by those who control the narrative. The Thespians and Thebans didn't fade into obscurity because they lacked courage. They faded because their sacrifices didn't fit the simpler, cleaner story Greece wanted to tell about itself, yet their legacy lingers in subtle ways. Thespiae's population was decimated at Thermopylae, an entire generation of men lost in a single day. The city never fully recovered, but its survivors spoke of their fathers and brothers with a pride that rivaled Sparta's. As for Thebes, its complicated post-war relationship with Persia may have erased its heroes from popular memory, but local traditions kept their names alive. Modern excavations near the battlefield continue to uncover artifacts: a Thespian helmet here, a Theban spearhead there, silent witnesses to a fuller, messier truth. Thermopylae wasn't just Sparta's defining moment. It was a tapestry of sacrifices, some celebrated, others quietly remembered, all woven into the same unbreakable stand. Xerxes entered Thermopylae expecting a swift victory parade, not a brutal three-day siege. The Persian king, seated atop his golden throne overlooking the pass, watched in disbelief as wave after wave of his finest troops shattered against Leonidas' defenses. Ancient historians paint vivid scenes of his mounting fury, throwing his scepter to the ground, twice leaping from his seat in frustration. even ordering his commanders to be whipped when their assaults failed. This wasn't just military setback, it was a direct challenge to his divine authority as the King of Kings. The Greeks weren't merely resisting, they were humiliating the ruler of the world's greatest empire in full view of his army. But beneath the rage lay something more surprising: grudging respect. Herodotus claims Xerxes repeatedly asked his advisors who these Spartans were and what could possibly motivate such suicidal defiance. When a captured Greek scout revealed the Spartans were preparing to die for honor, the Persian king reportedly laughed in disbelief until he witnessed their resolve firsthand. The spectacle of disciplined warriors fighting to the last man left an indelible mark. Later, when surveying the battlefield, Xerxes ordered Leonidas' body treated with uncharacteristic dignity, decapitated and crucified. Yes, but also carefully preserved, a paradoxical tribute to a worthy adversary. This wasn't just about vengeance, it was recognition that some forces couldn't be quantified by numbers alone. The battle's aftermath reveals how deeply Thermopylae shook Xerxes' confidence. His decision to march southward was no longer the triumphant procession he'd envisioned. Fearing further Spartan-led resistance, he altered his strategy, delaying his advance to await naval support, bypassing fortified positions whenever possible. The psychological impact rippled through his court. Persian records describe unusual wariness among commanders, who began advising caution over boldness. Even Xerxes' infamous order to whip the Hellespont, an act of divine retribution against the rebellious Sea, takes on new meaning when viewed through the lens of Thermopylae. Faced with forces he couldn't control, the king resorted to symbolic displays of dominance, desperate to reassert his shaken authority. Yet the most telling reaction came years later. During Persia's eventual retreat from Greece, Xerxes allegedly paused at Thermopylae to honor the fallen Spartans. Whether this was genuine admiration or political theater, it underscores a profound truth: the 300 had achieved what no army could. They'd forced the world's most powerful man to acknowledge their ideals as more formidable than his empire. In that moment, the myth of Persian invincibility cracked, not because they lost a battle, but because they'd been forced to respect their enemies. Thermopylae became less a military defeat than a cultural turning point, where the unstoppable force met the immovable code of honor, and neither emerged unchanged. Thermopylae was a Persian victory on paper, but the real cost to Xerxes' empire would become clear in the weeks that followed. While the pass finally fell, the 3-day delay had given Athens and other Greek city-states something priceless: time. Time to evacuate civilians, time to rally their fleets, time to fortify positions further south. The Spartans hadn't just died for honor, they'd turned their bodies into a living barricade, one that held back the tide of invasion long enough to change the course of history. Consider the strategic ripple effects. With Thermopylae secured, Xerxes expected Greece to crumble. Instead, he found Athenian ships already mobilized at Artemisium, their crews rested and ready. The Persian navy, which had planned to synchronize with the army's advance, now faced a reinforced Greek fleet that had used those precious days to study their tactics. On land, the Peloponnesian cities hastily built fortifications at the Isthmus of Corinth, creating a new defensive line Sparta could anchor. None of this would have been possible without Leonidas' sacrifice. The battle bought more than time, it bought clarity. Greek city-states that had been wavering now saw the existential threat Persia posed. Even rivals like Athens and Sparta, whose tensions had nearly torn Greece apart, began coordinating in ways previously unthinkable. But the most profound impact was psychological. News of the 300's last stand spread like wildfire through Greece, transforming them into symbols of resistance. Their defiance became a rallying cry at Salamis and Plataea, where Greek soldiers shouted Leonidas' name as they charged. Persian commanders, meanwhile, began noticing something unsettling. Their troops, though victorious, now hesitated before engaging Spartan-led forces. The legend of Thermopylae had weaponized fear, reversing its polarity. Where once Persian numbers terrified their enemies, now the mere sight of a Spartan shield could demoralize entire regiments. Xerxes won the battle but lost the narrative. His army's brutal casualties, an estimated 20,000 Persians, fell in the pass, forced him to reassess his entire campaign. The quick, decisive victory he'd promised his court now looked like a grinding war of attrition. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Morale, once unshakable, began to fray. When the Greeks finally defeated Persia at Salamis and Plataea, they didn't just win battles, they fulfilled the promise of Thermopylae. The 300 had shown that Persia wasn't invincible, and that revelation proved more devastating than any military defeat. History often measures victories in territory gained or kings toppled, but Thermopylae reminds us that real turning points are measured in courage and choices. The pass fell, but the stand there altered everything that followed. It's why we still speak of the 300 not as casualties of a lost battle, as architects of a victory they never lived to see. Their legacy wasn't just in the days they bought, but in the unbreakable idea they left behind that freedom could defy even the mightiest empire. The story of the 300 Spartans didn't just survive the centuries. It was carefully sculpted, polished, and weaponized by generations who needed its power. From the moment the dust settled at Thermopylae, the battle ceased to be just a military engagement. It became a symbol, a tool, a story too potent to leave to chance. The ancient Greeks, particularly the Athenians, were the first to shape the narrative. Herodotus, writing decades later, framed Thermopylae as the ultimate underdog story, a handful of free men defying an empire of slaves. But this wasn't just history, it was propaganda. Athens, locked in a rivalry with Sparta, had every reason to elevate their allies' sacrifice while downplaying their own later victories. By turning Leonidas into a martyr for Greek unity, they crafted a myth that served their political needs, a cautionary tale about what happened when Greeks stood divided. Fast forward to the Roman era, and the Spartan legend took on new life. Writers like Plutarch and Diodorus retold the story with added drama, emphasizing Spartan discipline as a moral lesson for Rome's own military culture. The tale became a mirror, reflecting whatever values the teller wished to promote. During the Renaissance, Thermopylae resurfaced as a symbol of republican virtue, name-dropped by philosophers and revolutionaries alike. But it wasn't until the 19th century that the myth truly went global. Nationalist movements across Europe latched onto the 300 as a template for patriotic sacrifice. In America, the Founding Fathers invoked Sparta as a model of civic duty, while later, both world wars saw Thermopylae recycled in recruitment posters, proof that a single story could flex to fit any era's agenda. Then came Hollywood. The 2004 film 300 didn't just adapt the myth, it supercharged it for the digital age. Director Zack Snyder's stylized visuals, all rippling abs and slow-motion violence, turned the battle into a visceral spectacle. But the movie's real power lay in its timing. Released amid the Iraq War, its portrayal of civilized Greeks resisting barbaric Persians struck a chord with audiences steeped in post-9/11 rhetoric. Critics accused it of historical distortion, but that missed the point. Like all great propaganda, the film wasn't selling facts, it was selling feeling. The Spartans became timeless avatars of Western resilience, their story stripped of nuance and repackaged as primal myth. Yet the most fascinating twist isn't how the tale has been used, it's why it resonates so deeply across cultures. Thermopylae taps into something universal, the allure of the impossible stand. Whether it's the Alamo, Rorke's Drift, or the Battle of Mogadishu, humans are drawn to stories where a few hold off the many. The Spartan myth endures not because it's true, but because it's useful. It reminds us that numbers aren't everything, that courage can defy logic, and that sometimes losing a battle can win a war of ideas. The real legacy of the 300 isn't in what happened at Thermopylae, but in what we've needed them to represent ever since. Herodotus' version of Thermopylae reads like an epic dramatic speeches, impossible odds, and heroic last stands. But how much of it can we trust? As the father of history, his account is our primary window into the battle, yet he was also a storyteller weaving narratives for an audience hungry for drama. Writing decades after the events, he relied on second-hand accounts, oral traditions, and his own travels through Greece and Persia. His work wasn't just history, it was performance meant to captivate listeners in Athenian symposiums. That's why his numbers defy logic. He claims Xerxes' army numbered in the millions, a logistical impossibility for ancient supply chains. Modern estimates suggest 200,000 at most, still staggering for the era but far from the earth-shaking horde Herodotus describes. Dig deeper and his biases come into sharp focus. An Athenian sympathizer, he had every reason to glorify Sparta's sacrifice while downplaying his own city's later victories at Salamis. Notice how he spins the Spartan stand as a moral lesson, free men fighting tyranny, rather than the tactical delaying action it likely was. Even his portrayal of Leonidas leans into myth, painting him as a flawless leader rather than a pragmatic king navigating Spartan politics. Then there's the dialogue. Did Persian messengers and Spartan warriors really trade such perfectly crafted quips mid-battle? Unlikely. These speeches feel like literary devices, inserted to heighten drama and underscore cultural contrast. But dismissing Herodotus as mere fiction misses the point. Ancient historians didn't share our obsession with objective facts. Their role was to preserve truths, even if that meant embellishing details. When Herodotus claims Spartan soldiers combed their hair before battle, was it factual? Maybe not, but it captures something real about their obsession with ritual and presentation. His account of Ephialtes' betrayal might be simplified, but it reflects genuine Greek anxieties about internal division. The ghosts of Thermopylae haunt his pages, not as precise recordings, but as echoes of what the battle meant to those who survived it. The real challenge isn't separating fact from fiction, it's understanding how the two intertwine. Archaeology lends some clarity. Persian arrowheads found near the pass confirm key details of the fighting, while Greek inscriptions honor the Thespians' Herodotus sidelines. Yet even these discoveries can't fully pierce the fog of legend. Perhaps the most telling clue lies in Herodotus' own methods. He often presents conflicting versions of events, inviting readers to judge. In doing so, he admits history is never singular. It's a mosaic of perspectives, each shaped by culture, memory, and need. His Thermopylae isn't a documentary. It's a mirror held up to 5th century Greece, reflecting its fears, ideals, and the stories it told itself to endure. Archaeology rarely offers neat answers, especially at a place like Thermopylae, where 2,500 years of erosion, landslides, and human activity have reshaped the landscape. Yet modern technology is peeling back those layers, revealing tantalizing clues about what really happened in that narrow pass. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR surveys have mapped the ancient coastline, showing how much the terrain has changed. Where the sea once lapped against cliffs, there's now miles of silt deposits. The famous hot gates aren't even visible today, buried under 20 meters of sediment. But in 2006, a team led by archaeologist Konstantinos Lagos made a breakthrough. They pinpointed the original battle site near the modern highway, where the pass would have been just 15 meters wide, perfect for a last stand. The most visceral discoveries come from the soil itself. Chemical analysis of the earth revealed startling spikes in zinc and phosphate, telltale signs of ancient bloodshed concentrated in specific areas. These blood metals cluster where historians believe the final defensive wall stood, corroborating ancient accounts of the most brutal fighting. Even more haunting are the arrowheads. Hundreds of bronze Persian arrowheads, many bent from impact, litter the site in a grim arc. Their distribution matches Herodotus' description of Persian archers unleashing volleys so thick they blotted out the sun. But here's what the artifacts don't show: Spartan weapons. Almost no Greek spearheads or swords have been found, suggesting the survivors, or the Persians systematically stripped the dead of their prized bronze arms after the battle. Perhaps the most revealing find isn't a weapon at all, but a humble round stone. In 2019, archaeologists uncovered a small marble disc near the suspected Spartan position, engraved with the letter lambda lambda, the symbol of Lace Demon, Sparta's formal name. Too light to be a sling stone, it was likely a token carried by a Spartan soldier, possibly dropped during the chaos of the final hours. This tiny object humanizes the battle in ways no ancient text can. It wasn't just 300 faceless warriors, it was 300 individuals, each carrying personal items, superstitions, and connections to homes they'd never see again. The Earth has also corrected some myths. For years, scholars debated whether the Anapia path, the secret trail used to flank the Greeks, could really accommodate thousands of Persian troops. Recent topographic scans show the path was even narrower than described, with sections requiring single-file movement. This forces us to rethink the battle's climax. The Persians didn't swarm the Greeks in overwhelming numbers all at once. They trickled through in small groups, turning the final hours into a desperate, scattered struggle rather than a single heroic last stand. Thermopylae's archaeology does something remarkable. It bridges the gap between legend and logistics. The arrowheads confirm the Persian onslaught, the blood metals verify the brutality, and the shifting coastline explains why later visitors like Cicero couldn't find the pass. But the land guards its secrets tightly. No mass graves have been found, no Spartan shields unearthed. The silence of the soil reminds us that some truths are irrecoverable, lost to time, or perhaps never recorded at all. What remains is a mosaic of clues, each fragment whispering that the real battle was messier, stranger, and more human than the myth allows. The Spartan phalanx wasn't just a formation, it was a living, breathing machine of war. Picture a single row of warriors, each gripping a spear over 8 feet long, their massive round shields overlapping like the scales of a bronze serpent. Now multiply that row 10 deep, with every man's shield protecting not just himself but the soldier to his left. This was the genius of the phalanx, a shield wall so tight that even the most disciplined Persian infantry couldn't find an opening. At Thermopylae, where the narrow pass compressed the battlefield into a brutal funnel, this formation became an unstoppable force. What made it so devastating wasn't just the equipment, though the Spartans' long dory spears and heavy aspis shields were perfectly suited for this style of combat. It was the years of relentless drilling that turned individual warriors into a single, cohesive unit. While other Greek city-states might muster farmers and craftsmen when war came, Spartans trained year-round. They practiced advancing in perfect unison, maintaining formation even over rough terrain, and rotating fresh fighters to the front without breaking ranks. In the chaos of battle, where most armies dissolved into individual skirmishes, the Spartan phalanx held its shape like a rock against the tide. The Persians, for all their numbers, had never faced anything like it. Their infantry typically fought in looser formations, relying on mobility and archery volleys. At Thermopylae, those tactics collapsed, charging uphill into a wall of spear points. Their shorter swords couldn't reach past the Greek shields. The phalanx didn't just defend, it pushed forward with steady, grinding pressure, each step driving the enemy back. Herodotus describes Persian commanders whipping their troops forward, only to watch them crumple against the bronze wall. Even Xerxes' elite immortals, trained for close combat, found themselves outmatched. The phalanx turned the pass into a meat grinder, where Spartan discipline and terrain conspired to nullify every Persian advantage. But the formation had vulnerabilities. Its strength lay in its cohesion. Break that, and the phalanx could unravel. That's why the Spartans placed their best warriors in the front and rear ranks. The front-line fighters, called the promontory, were the tip of the spear, while the rear ranks physically pushed forward, adding momentum to the advance. At Thermopylae, this structure allowed them to hold for days, rotating wounded soldiers out and fresh men in without losing momentum. Yet the system wasn't foolproof. If enemy forces flanked the formation, as the Persians eventually did via the mountain path, the phalanx's rigid structure became a death trap. Unable to pivot quickly, the Spartans found themselves caught between hammer and anvil. The legacy of the phalanx outlasted Thermopylae. Later Greek generals refined the tactic, combining it with cavalry and skirmishers to create more flexible armies. But at its core, the lesson remained. Warfare wasn't just about individual bravery, but about unity. A single Spartan might be a formidable fighter, but 300 moving as one became an unstoppable force. That's why, even in defeat, their stand resonated across the ancient world. They hadn't just fought, they demonstrated a new way of waging war, where discipline and teamwork could defy even the mightiest empire. The phalanx wasn't just a tactic, it was the physical expression of Sparta's entire philosophy: strength through unity, victory through sacrifice. The Persian army at Thermopylae wasn't just a blunt instrument, it was a precision tool honed by decades of imperial conquest. Xerxes' forces brought an arsenal of tactics tailored to overwhelm any opponent, yet the narrow pass turned their greatest strengths into vulnerabilities. Take their cavalry, for instance. Persian horsemen were legendary, capable of devastating flanking maneuvers on open ground. But at Thermopylae, where the cliffs pinched the battlefield into a suffocating corridor, those thundering charges became useless. Mounted archers, who could normally rain arrows while circling enemies, found themselves trapped in a space where their mobility meant nothing. The land itself had disarmed them before the first spear was thrown. Then there were the immortals, Xerxes' personal guard and the empire's most feared infantry. Clad in scaled armor and wielding short spears, they were trained to fight in tight formations, yet even they struggled against the Greek phalanx. The problem wasn't just the Spartans' longer spears, it was the relentless pressure of their advance. Persian tactics relied on flexibility, using waves of lightly armored skirmishers to soften enemies before the immortals moved in for the kill. But in the pass, there was no room for this layered approach. Every assault funneled into a frontal collision where discipline trumped numbers. Even their famed archers, whose volleys could darken the sky, found their arrows bouncing harmlessly off bronze shields or embedding uselessly in the cliffs. Xerxes' most underrated weapon wasn't a type of soldier, it was logistics. The Persians mastered the art of moving vast armies across continents, with supply trains stretching back to the Hellespont. At Thermopylae, this became a liability. Feeding 200,000 men in a cramped coastal pass required constant shipments of grain and water, straining their carefully planned systems. Meanwhile, the Greeks, fighting on home soil, could rely on local knowledge and shorter supply lines. the Persians' very scale, so imposing on paper, became a slow-burning crisis as the stalemate dragged on. The real surprise was how quickly Persian commanders adapted. When frontal assaults failed, they experimented with night attacks, probing for weaknesses. When arrows proved ineffective, they sent waves of expendable conscripts to exhaust the Greeks. And when brute force stalled, they turned to subterfuge, finding the mountain path that would seal Thermopylae's fate. This wasn't the mindless horde of legend. It was an army learning in real time, improvising against an enemy that defied all their playbooks. Their eventual victory came not from overwhelming force, but from recognizing when to stop fighting the battle they'd planned and start fighting the one they'd been given. The story of the 300 Spartans didn't just survive the ages, it evolved, mutating to fit the fears and ideals of every generation that retold it. Within decades of the battle, Greek poets were already reframing Thermopylae as more than a military defeat. It became a moral victory, a parable about the power of free men against tyranny. Simonides of Chios, the closest thing antiquity had to a war correspondent, immortalized the Spartans in verse. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. These words, carved onto memorials across Greece, didn't just honor the dead. They weaponized their memory, turning a tactical sacrifice into a rallying cry for pan-Hellenic unity against Persia. By the Roman era, the legend had taken on new shades. Philosophers like Cicero held up Spartan discipline as a model for Roman virtue, while Plutarch wove dramatic dialogues around Leonidas that read like ancient fan fiction. The battle became a flexible symbol, sometimes representing republican ideals, other times serving as a cautionary tale about the perils of autocracy. When the Renaissance rediscovered classical texts, Thermopylae found fresh life in Machiavelli's political treatises and the speeches of revolutionaries. But it was the 19th century that truly globalized the myth. From the battlefields of Napoleon to the trenches of World War I, commanders invoked the 300 to inspire their own troops to hold the line against impossible odds. Hollywood's obsession with the story reveals just how malleable the legend has become. The 1962 film The 300 Spartans framed Thermopylae as a Cold War allegory, with the Greeks standing in for Western democracy against Persian totalitarianism. Zack Snyder's 2007 300 cranked the symbolism to 11, blending Frank Miller's hyper-stylized comic book aesthetic with post-9/11 anxieties about East-West conflict. Critics lambasted its historical inaccuracies, but the movie's visual language, the rippling abs, the monstrous Persian hordes wasn't meant to educate. It tapped into something primal, the allure of the underdog, the fantasy of righteous defiance. What's fascinating isn't just how the story changes, but what stays constant. Across 3 millennia, the core appeal remains the same. The idea that a handful of determined individuals can alter the course of history through sheer will. Modern military academies still teach Thermopylae as a lesson in leadership. Political movements from the American Revolution to the Arab Spring have borrowed its imagery. Even video games and anime reinterpret the battle, proving its framework adapts to any medium. The 300 endure not because they won, but because they chose to stand, and that choice, more than any victory, echoes through time. Yet beneath all the myth-making lies a quieter truth. The real cultural power of Thermopylae comes from its humanity. These weren't superheroes, they were tired, desperate men fighting for something bigger than themselves. That's why the story transcends cultures and eras. It's not about Spartans or Persians. It's about the universal moment when ordinary people decide they'd rather die on their feet than live on their knees. Whether carved on an ancient stele or rendered in CGI, that's a truth that never loses its grip on the human imagination. The legend of the 300 Spartans has been polished to such a shine over centuries that it's hard to separate fact from folklore. One of the most persistent myths, the idea that these warriors were invincible super soldiers who could take on thousands single-handedly. The truth is far more interesting. They were highly trained, yes, but still human. Ancient sources describe Spartans bleeding, breaking ranks when overwhelmed, and even retreating when tactics demanded it. Their real strength wasn't supernatural skill. It was a lifetime of drilled discipline that let them fight as one cohesive machine. Then there's the numbers game. Hollywood loves the image of 300 Spartans standing alone against millions, but history tells a different story. While the core Spartan contingent was indeed small, likely closer to 300 full citizens, they were supported by several thousand other Greek allies, Thespians, Thebans, and Helot attendants who fought beside them. Even the Persian numbers were exaggerated. Herodotus' claim of over 2 million soldiers is logistically impossible. Modern estimates suggest Xerxes' forces likely numbered around 200,000. Still overwhelming, but not the earth-shaking horde of legend. Another stubborn myth paints the Spartans as the sole defenders of Greek freedom. In reality, Thermopylae was just one piece of a larger strategy. The stand bought time for Athens to evacuate and for the Greek navy to regroup at Salamis, a coordinated effort that gets overshadowed by the Spartan-centric narrative. Even the famous "come and take them" line attributed to Leonidas is probably apocryphal. Such quippy battle banter was a common literary device in ancient histories, not battlefield reporting. Perhaps the most misleading misconception is that every Spartan fought to the death willingly. While their culture prized honor above survival, accounts suggest some were sent away as messengers, others blinded in battle. Two survivors, Pantites and Aristodemus, faced disgrace at home, proof that the last stand wasn't as clean as later storytellers preferred. The messy human reality of fear, fatigue, and imperfect choices makes their stand more remarkable, not less. They weren't mythic figures, they were men who chose to hold the line when others might have fled. The real tragedy of these myths isn't that they're inaccurate, it's that they obscure the deeper lessons of Thermopylae. This wasn't just about Spartan glory, it was about coalition warfare, tactical ingenuity, and the power of terrain. By stripping away the Hollywood sheen, we don't diminish the Spartans, we meet them as they truly were, flawed, fierce, and far more compelling than any legend could allow. Before the first Spartan shield was raised at Thermopylae, King Leonidas sought guidance from the most revered spiritual authority in the Greek world, the Oracle of Delphi. Perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, this sacred site wasn't just a place of worship, it was the ancient equivalent of a strategic think tank. The prophecies delivered here shaped empires, launched wars, and in the case of Thermopylae, set the stage for one of history's most iconic last stands. The oracle's cryptic words carried immense weight. Her pronouncements weren't taken lightly, especially when the survival of Sparta hung in the balance. According to Herodotus, the Delphic prophecy given to Leonidas was chillingly specific. Either Sparta would be destroyed by the invading Persians, or a Spartan king must perish. This wasn't vague fortune-telling, it was a divine ultimatum that framed Leonidas' entire mission. Modern historians debate whether the oracle truly predicted these events or if the prophecy was retroactively crafted to fit the outcome. But for the Spartans, steeped in a culture where the gods will shape every major decision, these words weren't open to interpretation. They became the spiritual foundation for what followed, a king marching to certain death, not just for tactical advantage, but as a sacred duty. The Delphic connection reveals how deeply intertwined religion and warfare were in ancient Greek strategy. Commanders didn't just study terrain and troop numbers, They scrutinized sacrifices for favorable omens, delayed battles based on lunar cycles, and interpreted every natural phenomenon as divine communication. Before Thermopylae, Spartan scouts reported seeing Persian arrows literally blotting out the sun, an event their allies initially took as a bad omen. Leonidas, ever the master of psychological warfare, turned it into a rallying cry. Good news, we'll fight in the shade. This moment captures the dual reality of ancient warfare, pragmatic tactics walking hand in hand with unshakable faith in cosmic signs. Beyond Delphi, Sparta had its own rich tradition of war omens. The presence of the twin kings Leonidas and his co-ruler Leotychides meant two sets of royal priests scrutinizing sacrifices before battle. A flawed ritual or inauspicious sign could halt an entire campaign, no matter how strategically sound. At Thermopylae, the gods seemed to speak clearly through multiple channels. Earthquakes were interpreted as Poseidon's disapproval of Persian naval ambitions, while local oracles reportedly warned of the strength of lions being overcome. For the superstitious Spartans, these signs weren't metaphors. They were divine confirmation that their sacrifice would resonate beyond mortal comprehension. The legacy of these beliefs outlasted the battle itself. After Thermopylae, the Greeks erected monuments not just to Spartan courage, but to Apollo's guidance. The oracle's reputation soared, her ambiguous prophecies reinterpreted as brilliant foresight. Even Xerxes, despite his initial mockery of Greek superstitions, reportedly consulted his own magi after the battle, seeking cosmic validation for his stalled invasion. This intersection of faith and warfare wasn't unique to Greece. Persian commanders similarly relied on Zoroastrian omens, but the Spartan example became legendary because it fused divine mandate with human agency. Leonidas didn't blindly follow fate. He wielded prophecy as both sword and shield, turning spiritual conviction into psychological warfare. His last stand wasn't just a military tactic. It was the ultimate offering on the altar of destiny. The Spartan stand at Thermopylae wasn't unique in its tragedy. It was part of an ancient tradition where a few faced the many in desperate, defiant last stands. But what sets it apart from other legendary battles like the Alamo or Little Bighorn? The answer lies not just in scale or outcome, but in how each moment was remembered and why. Take the Alamo in 1836, where around 200 Texian rebels held off thousands of Mexican troops for 13 days. Like Thermopylae, it was a tactical defeat that became a symbolic victory, a rallying cry that fueled eventual independence. But where the Spartans fought as professional soldiers bound by duty, the Alamo's defenders were a mix of adventurers, settlers, and idealists, united less by discipline than by shared defiance. Both stands were doomed from the start, yet their cultural afterlife couldn't be more different. The Alamo's myth grew from the raw materials of American expansion, while Thermopylae became a universal metaphor for resistance against tyranny. Then there's the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors annihilated Custer's 7th Cavalry. At first glance, it seems the inverse of Thermopylae, a numerically superior force crushing a smaller one. But dig deeper and eerie parallels emerge. Like Leonidas, Custer knowingly walked into a trap, underestimating his enemy's cohesion and terrain knowledge. Both battles became cautionary tales about hubris, though in Custer's case, the lesson was etched by his opponent's victory rather than his own sacrifice. The Spartans were memorialized by the very empire that defeated them, while the Native American perspective at Little Bighorn was suppressed for generations. Their triumph twisted into a massacre by the losing side's historians. Even more revealing are the last stands that didn't become legends. In 60 AD, Boudicca's Britons made a final charge against Roman legions, dying to the last woman and child. Their story, equally dramatic, lacks Thermopylae's cultural staying power. Why? Because history is shaped by who tells it. The Greeks, masters of poetry and drama, turned Thermopylae into a stage for heroism. The Spartans didn't just die, they performed their deaths with quotable defiance, crafting a narrative that resonated across millennia. By contrast, Boudica's story survived through Roman historians who framed her as a barbarian. Thermopylae's endurance isn't just about what happened, it's about how the story was told, polished, and weaponized by those who needed its power. The true legacy of these battles lies in their echoes. When Winston Churchill invoked Thermopylae during World War II, or when Texas politicians rally at the Alamo, they're not recalling facts, they're summoning symbols. Last stands endure not because they changed battlefields, but because they shape imaginations. The Spartans didn't win at Thermopylae, but their story did. And that's why, of all history's doomed stands, theirs still burns brightest. The Spartan education system, known as the Agoge, wasn't just training, it was a decades-long crucible designed to forge boys into unbreakable weapons of war. From the moment a child was born, their fate hinged on a brutal evaluation. Spartan elders inspected newborns for physical flaws, and those deemed weak or sickly were left exposed on Mount Taygetos. Survival wasn't a right, it was the first test. Those who passed it entered a world where comfort was the enemy and suffering was the curriculum. At age 7, boys were taken from their families and plunged into the Agoge's merciless machinery. They lived in communal barracks, sleeping on reed mats they'd gathered themselves from the Eurotas River. No blankets, no pillows, just the harsh bite of winter air to harden them. Hunger was constant. Meals were deliberately meager, forcing boys to steal food to survive. But getting caught meant severe punishment, not for stealing, but for failing to evade detection. The lesson was clear: cunning mattered as much as strength. Discipline was relentless. Older boys administered beatings to enforce obedience, and fights were encouraged to weed out weakness. But this wasn't mindless violence, it was calculated conditioning. Spartans believed pain taught resilience, and humiliation bred humility. One notorious ritual, the diamastagosis, saw boys whipped bloody at the altar of Artemis Orthia, competing to endure the most lashes without crying out. Those who collapsed were scorned, those who stood firm earned respect. Yet the Agoge wasn't just physical. Literacy was taught sparingly, but rhetoric and laconic speech, the art of delivering piercing truths in few words, were honed to razor sharpness. A Spartan's worth wasn't just in his sword arm, but in his ability to think under pressure, to lead, and to inspire. By their teens, trainees entered the Crypteia, a shadowy phase where they were sent into the wilderness with nothing but a dagger, surviving off the land, and sometimes the Helot population. This wasn't just survival training, it was psychological warfare. Helots, Sparta's enslaved underclass, outnumbered citizens 10-1, and the Crypteia served as both a rite of passage and a terror tactic. Boys learned to stalk, to kill, and to live with the constant awareness that weakness meant death. When these teenagers finally emerged as full citizens at age 20, they weren't just soldiers, they were embodiments of Sparta's darkest ideals, shaped by a system that prized the collective over the individual, duty over desire. The men who stood at Thermopylae weren't born warriors, they were manufactured by design. Every scar, every hunger pang, every night spent shivering in the barracks had prepared them for one moment, to hold the line no matter the cost. When Leonidas chose his 300, he wasn't selecting random volunteers. He was drawing from a pool of men who'd spent their lives rehearsing for sacrifice. The Agoge didn't just teach them to fight, it taught them to die without flinching. That's why, even outnumbered, they didn't break. Their entire lives had been one long lesson in standing firm. The lessons of Thermopylae echo through modern war colleges and strategy sessions, not because of its outcome, but because of what it reveals about the psychology of combat. Military theorists from Clausewitz to modern Pentagon planners have dissected the Spartan stand, uncovering principles that transcend ancient warfare. At its core, Thermopylae was a masterclass in leveraging terrain, a reminder that geography can be as decisive as firepower. Today's special forces study how Leonidas turned the pass into a force multiplier, neutralizing Persia's numerical advantage. In Afghanistan's mountain passes or Ukraine's urban choke points, the same principle applies. Smart positioning can turn a small, disciplined unit into an immovable object. But the real revelation lies in what Spartans called karteria, endurance beyond reason. Modern militaries have institutionalized this concept through survival training, teaching soldiers to function despite exhaustion, hunger, and overwhelming odds. The Navy SEAL's infamous Hell Week, where candidates go days without sleep, mirrors the Spartan Agoge's brutal conditioning. Both systems recognize a fundamental truth: battles aren't won by equipment alone, but by the mental resilience of those wielding it. When Ukrainian defenders held Kiev against Russia's initial assault, their ability to endure constant bombardment and freezing trenches wasn't just tactics. It was the modern equivalent of Spartans bracing against wave after wave of Persian assaults. Leadership at Thermopylae offers another timeless lesson. Leonidas didn't command through authority alone. He led from the front, eating the same rations and sleeping on the same rocky ground as his men. This ethos lives on in today's officer training. The U.S. Army's Be No Do model emphasizes that leaders must embody the standards they set, a direct lineage to the Spartan king who stood shoulder to shield with his warriors. Even the controversial decision to stay and die had strategic logic. It bought time for Greece's survival. Parallels emerge in modern rearguard actions, like the British stand at Dunkirk or the Filipino resistance on Baton, where sacrifice served larger operational goals. Yet Thermopylae also warns against overconfidence. The Spartans assumed the Anapaea path was secure, a fatal miscalculation. Contemporary militaries call this threat blindness, seen when French planners underestimated the Ardennes forest in World War II, or when Saddam Hussein dismissed the feasibility of desert flanking maneuvers. The pass's fall underscores a hard truth: no defensive position is impervious. Modern armies mitigate this through redundancy-layered defenses, drone surveillance, and rapid reaction forces. But the core lesson remains: complacency is the deadliest vulnerability. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is the Spartan example of cohesive unit identity. Their phalanx didn't work because of individual skill, but because each man trusted his neighbor implicitly. Today's combat psychologists call this unit cohesion, the invisible glue that makes soldiers fight harder for their squad than any abstract cause. From the brotherhood of the French Foreign Legion to the no man left behind ethos of U.S. Marines, Thermopylae's ghost whispers that brotherhood can be the ultimate force multiplier. The battle's true value to modern strategy isn't in mimicking ancient tactics, but in understanding the human elements that made them effective. Drones may replace spears and satellites scout mountain trails, but the essence of warfare remains unchanged: the interplay of terrain, morale, leadership, and the unquantifiable will to stand when others flee. Thermopylae endures not as a blueprint, but as a mirror, reflecting timeless truths about what makes some forces break while others hold. The clash at Thermopylae wasn't just a test of steel and sinew. It was a high-stakes game of nerves where psychological warfare shaped the battle as decisively as any spear thrust. From the moment the Persian envoy arrived demanding the Greeks surrender their weapons, Leonidas turned words into weapons. His legendary reply, "Come and take them," wasn't just defiance, it was a masterstroke of intimidation. By boiling Spartan resolve down to 4 laconic words, he sent an unmistakable message. These weren't just warriors, but men who welcomed annihilation. That unshakable confidence rattled the Persian command. Xerxes, accustomed to enemies crumbling before his mere presence, reportedly delayed his first assault for days, expecting the Greeks to flee. But the Spartans didn't just hold their ground, they openly groomed their hair before battle, a deliberate display of calm that unnerved observers. This wasn't bravado, it was theater, designed to make the enemy question their own superiority. The Persians countered with their own psychological arsenal. When initial attacks faltered, Xerxes staged a chilling spectacle, forcing captured Greek scouts to witness his troops flogging the sea as punishment for a storm that wrecked their ships. The message was clear, even nature bowed to Persian might. He positioned his golden throne on a hillside overlooking the pass, ensuring the Greeks could see their king watching like an impassive god. Yet these displays backfired. The Spartans, raised on a diet of hardship and stoicism, interpreted Persian opulence as weakness. Their laughter at the sight of whipped water became its own morale booster, reinforcing their contempt for an enemy they viewed as decadent and superstitious. Nightfall brought darker mind games. The Greeks lit massive bonfires, singing war hymns that echoed through the pass, a sonic reminder that they remained unbroken. Persian scouts reported Spartans wrestling and exercising casually between attacks, as if the battle were merely an interlude. These weren't spontaneous acts, they were calculated provocations meant to erode the invaders' confidence. Even the geography became a psychological weapon. The pass's narrow confines amplified the sound of dying Persians, their screams bouncing off the cliffs to demoralize fresh waves of attackers. Xerxes' ultimate psychological victory, the betrayal by Ephialtes, also revealed a cultural blind spot. The Persians assumed all Greeks could be bought or bullied. When their flanking maneuver succeeded, they expected the remaining defenders to beg for mercy. Instead, they met something far more terrifying: men who saw their own deaths as inevitable and chose to weaponize them. The Spartans' final hours weren't spent in prayer or panic, but in controlled, almost ritualistic violence, a performance meant to sear their legend into Persian memory. This wasn't just fighting, it was psychological branding, ensuring that even in defeat, their enemies would carry the scars of Thermopylae home. The battle's aftermath proved how deeply these mind games cut. Persian accounts describe soldiers refusing to engage Spartans in later battles, their morale shattered by the pass's horrors. Xerxes himself allegedly had nightmares of Leonidas, a testament to how thoroughly 300 men had colonized the imagination of an empire. Thermopylae's real power wasn't in its body count, but in its psychic shockwave, proof that the most formidable weapon isn't always a blade, but the unbreakable will to wield it. While the warriors of Sparta dominate history books, the real secret behind their legendary society wasn't just the men, it was the women who shaped them. Unlike the cloistered, secluded women of Athens, Spartan females were a force unto themselves. From childhood, they trained alongside boys in athletics, competing in foot races and wrestling matches under the Mediterranean sun. Education wasn't reserved for sons alone. Girls studied poetry, music, and even philosophy, their voices encouraged in public debates. This wasn't just progressive for ancient Greece, it was revolutionary. A Spartan mother's farewell to her son wasn't a tearful embrace but a stern command. Return with your shield or on it. The message was clear: honor mattered more than survival. This extraordinary autonomy stemmed from Sparta's singular focus on military excellence. With men constantly training or at war, women managed estates, oversaw finances, and supervised the helot workforce that kept Sparta functioning. They weren't just wives, they were stewards of a warrior economy. Aristotle later criticized Spartan women for their unwomanly influence, but that was precisely the point. Sparta needed women who could think strategically because every childbirth was a matter of state policy. Healthy sons meant future soldiers, so physical fitness wasn't optional. Young women performed dances weighted down with heavy bronze helmets, their strength cultivated to bear robust children. Their value wasn't tied to domesticity, but to their ability to produce and inspire warriors. The psychological impact on Spartan men was profound. Raised by mothers who embodied discipline, boys learned early that weakness wouldn't be tolerated, not even with maternal sympathy. When a soldier faltered, it wasn't just his reputation at stake, but his family's. Women publicly shamed cowardice, even celebrating sons who died bravely while mocking those who survived defeat. This cultural pressure created a feedback loop. Warriors fought harder knowing their harshest critics waited at home. The famed Spartan resilience at Thermopylae didn't spring from nowhere. It was forged in a society where women stoked the fires of martial pride daily. Yet Sparta's gender roles weren't as egalitarian as they seemed. Women still couldn't hold political office, and their freedoms served a utilitarian purpose, strengthening the state. What looked like liberation was actually another form of service. Even their famed outspokenness had limits. A woman might advise her husband, but public leadership remained male-dominated. Still, compared to the silent shadows of Athenian wives, Spartan women were thunderclaps. When a foreign queen once asked why Spartan women alone ruled their men, the reply was telling: because we alone give birth to real men. The legacy of Spartan women echoes in the Thermopylae story. While no historical record names specific women influencing Leonidas' last stand, their ethos permeated the battle. The warriors who held the pass didn't just fight for king and country, they fought for mothers and wives who'd rather mourn a corpse than welcome a coward. This wasn't just a society that produced great soldiers. It was one where every facet of life, down to gender norms, was engineered to sustain them. The real miracle of Sparta wasn't its undefeated army, but the unsung women who made its existence possible. Thermopylae wasn't just a battle of spears and shields. It was a brutal showdown with nature itself. Imagine the late summer heat of 480 B. See, the air thick with the stench of sweat and salt as thousands of armored men clashed in a coastal pass barely wider than a modern highway. For the Greeks, the season was both ally and enemy. The August sun beat down mercilessly, but it also meant the ground was firm underfoot, preventing the mud that might have slowed their phalanx. The Persians, however, faced a cruel paradox. Their sheer numbers, which should have been an advantage, became a liability in the suffocating heat. Men in heavy linen armor fainted from dehydration, while the Greeks, accustomed to the Mediterranean climate, conserved energy by fighting in shorter, disciplined rotations. Then there was the terrain, a geographical trap disguised as a defensive dream. The Pass of Thermopylae, meaning hot gates, wasn't just named for its thermal springs. The narrow strip between Mount Calidromo and the Malian Gulf forced the Persian army into a bottleneck where their cavalry, the terror of open plains, became useless. The rocky ground prevented chariots from maneuvering, and the steep cliffs echoed with the screams of fallen soldiers, amplifying the chaos. But the land wasn't uniformly kind to the defenders. The same cliffs that protected their flanks also limited escape routes, and the loose shale underfoot made footing treacherous during combat. When the Persians finally flanked the Greeks via the Anapia path, It was the terrain itself that sealed their fate, a hidden trail known only to local shepherds, now turned against them. Water played a silent but decisive role. The Greeks positioned themselves near the Phoenix stream, a freshwater source that kept them supplied, while the Persians relied on lengthy supply lines stretching back to their fleet. As the stalemate dragged on, Xerxes' army faced a creeping crisis: thirst. The Malian Gulf's brackish water was undrinkable, and the summer heat evaporated what little pooled in rocky crevices. Meanwhile, the Spartans used the landscape to psychological effect. Herodotus describes them exercising and grooming in full view of Persian scouts, a display of calm that underscored their familiarity with the harsh environment. Even the time of day shaped the battle's rhythm. The Greeks fought most fiercely at dawn and dusk, when the low sun blinded Persian attackers advancing eastward. At midday, when shadows vanished and the heat peaked, both sides retreated to tend to wounds, but the Spartans used these lulls to rebuild their makeshift wall, while the Persians struggled to cool their overheated armor. The final betrayal came not just from Ephialtes, but from the land itself. The Anapia path, though treacherous, was passable under a full moon, the very conditions the Persians exploited for their night march. Nature, it seemed, was never neutral. Every rock, every breeze, every drop of water became a weapon in the hands of those who knew how to wield it. The legacy of Thermopylae's environmental warfare endures in military strategy today. From the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan, the lesson remains: the land is never just a backdrop. It's an active participant, favoring those who listen to its whispers and punishing those who ignore its warnings. The Spartans didn't just fight the Persians, they fought with the earth itself, and for 3 days that alliance held, until it didn't. The story of the 300 Spartans isn't just a relic of the past, it's a living testament to how history and legend intertwine, each shaping the other across centuries. What makes Thermopylae so enduring isn't merely the spectacle of a few defying the many, but the way the battle forces us to confront deeper questions about courage, leadership, and the price of defiance. The myths that grew around Leonidas and his warriors, the flawless heroes standing alone against a faceless horde, may simplify the truth, but they don't diminish it. If anything, peeling back those layers reveals something far more compelling: real men, bound by discipline and duty, who chose to make their last stand a lesson for the ages. Consider how rarely history preserves the names of the defeated. Most battles fade into obscurity unless they tip the scales of empires. Yet here we are, 2.5 millennia later, still dissecting every arrowhead and every ancient account, still haunted by the image of Spartans bracing for the final onslaught. That's the paradox of Thermopylae, a tactical defeat that became a cultural victory. The Spartans didn't win the day, but they won the narrative, proving that resilience can outlast even the mightiest empires. Their story resonates because it taps into something universal: the allure of standing firm when the world expects you to crumble. But Thermopylae's legacy isn't just about the past. It's a mirror for every generation that faces its own impossible odds. During World War II, Allied soldiers scribbled "Malon Labe," come and take them, on their helmets as they stormed Normandy's beaches. In the Cold War, Thermopylae became shorthand for resisting tyranny, invoked by politicians and protesters alike. Even today, the battle's echoes appear in unexpected places, from sports teams adopting Spartan imagery to tech founders quoting Leonidas in keynote speeches. The 300 have become a shorthand for grit, a symbol that transcends time and culture. What's truly remarkable, though, is how the story continues to evolve. Every retelling, from Herodotus to Hollywood, adds new layers reflecting the fears and ideals of the era. The Spartans have been painted as proto-democrats, authoritarian zealots, and everything in between. Yet beneath the shifting interpretations lies an unchanging core, the idea that some principles are worth dying for. That's why Thermopylae endures, not because it was unique, but because it was human. These weren't gods or monsters, they were flesh and blood warriors who made a choice, and in doing so became something more. As we wrap up this journey through history and myth, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What other battles or historical mysteries should we explore next? The past is full of stories waiting to be unpacked, each with its own blend of fact and legend. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation in the comments. After all, history isn't just something we study, it's something we keep alive, one question at a time.